Some encounters don't begin with a greeting. They begin with a silence, so heavy it feels like the air forgot how to move. The golden light of the cafe stretched across polished wood floors and glass walls, catching on reflections that made the evening feel softer than it really was. But Ethan Cole stopped just inside the doorway like something unseen had reached out and held him in place. Because across the room, seated by the window where the city lights bled into the dark like distant stars, was a woman he had convinced himself no longer existed in his world. Naomi Brooks, not as a memory, not as a regret buried under board meetings and quarterly reports, but real, breathing, present, her posture calm, her gaze lowered to the small figure beside her. And for a moment, everything that defined him, his schedule, his influence, the silent power that usually followed him into any room, collapsed into something quieter, something uncertain, because she didn't look up when he entered, didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even acknowledge the subtle change in atmosphere that usually came with his presence, as if the version of him that once mattered to her had been erased so completely it left no echo behind. And that absence, that deliberate indifference, struck harder than any confrontation ever could, pulling him deeper into a moment he didn't understand, yet couldn't walk away from. The low hum of conversations around him fading into a distant blur while his eyes remained fixed on the angle of her shoulders. The stillness in her hands, the quiet way she existed without seeking permission from the room or from him. And then the child moved, a small, unguarded motion, the kind that doesn't announce itself but demands to be seen anyway. And Ethan's breath caught before he could stop it, because there was something in that face, something too precise to ignore, the curve of the cheek, the set of the eyes, a familiarity that didn't ask for confirmation but instead settled into his chest with a weight that felt both impossible and undeniable. And suddenly the years between this moment and the last time he saw her collapsed into fragments, flashes of a past he had chosen not to revisit, a door closing with more finality than he had understood at the time, a conversation left unfinished because he had convinced himself that walking away was cleaner, simpler, necessary, a decision framed as logic, as strategy, as survival in a world that rewarded distance over attachment. And yet standing here now, that reasoning felt thin, almost hollow, like a script he had memorized but no longer believed, because Naomi Brooks was no longer the woman who waited for answers. She wasn't searching the room for him. She wasn't carrying the weight of something unsaid in her posture. She was simply present, grounded, complete in a way that excluded him entirely. And the realization didn't arrive with drama or noise, but with a quiet precision that unsettled him more than anything loud ever could, making him aware of every small detail he had overlooked. The way her hand rested lightly near the child's shoulder, protective without tension, the ease in her breathing, the absence of hesitation in her movements, all of it painting a picture of a life that had continued without him, that had grown, adapted, and solidified into something he was now standing outside of. And for the first time in years, Ethan hesitated, not because he didn't know how to approach someone, but because he didn't know if he had the right to, the question forming without permission, without structure, lingering in the space between who he had been and who he was now trying to be in this moment. And still, his feet moved, drawn forward by something deeper than curiosity, something closer to recognition. Each step measured, quieter than usual, as if the floor beneath him required a different kind of respect, the kind that comes when you realize the ground you're walking on no longer belongs to you. And when he finally stood close enough to see her clearly, the years became undeniable, not in the sense of time lost, but in the way they had reshaped her into someone he didn't fully know anymore, her expression calm, her presence steady, her silence intentional. And when she finally looked up, it wasn't with surprise or anger, but with a composed acknowledgement that carried no invitation, no warmth, no lingering attachment, just a simple recognition that he existed in front of her, nothing more, nothing less. And that was when he understood that whatever he thought he had left behind had not been waiting for him to return. It had moved forward without him, built something beyond him, and now stood as a truth he could no longer ignore, because the child turned again, closer this time, eyes meeting his for a brief, unguarded second. And in that fleeting moment, something shifted inside Ethan, not a dramatic collapse, not a visible reaction, but a quiet fracture that spread through his certainty, through the version of his life he had carefully constructed, because there are truths that don't announce themselves with explanation. They arrive in silence, in resemblance, in presence, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. And as he stood there, caught between the past he had chosen and the present he could no longer control, one realization began to take shape with a clarity that left no room for denial. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a simple encounter. This was a moment waiting to be understood, and he wasn't ready for what it meant. The space between them did not close when he stepped closer. It stretched, thin and precise, like something carefully measured over time, and Ethan found himself stopping just short of the table, not out of uncertainty in his movement, but because something in Naomi's stillness made it clear that proximity no longer meant access. And for a second, he simply stood there, aware of the quiet weight in the air, aware of the way the city lights reflected across the glass behind her, framing her in a glow that felt distant, untouchable. And then the child shifted again, small fingers curling around the edge of the table, eyes lifting with a kind of curiosity that had not yet learned to filter the world. And Ethan saw it more clearly this time, not just resemblance, but detail, something exact in the shape of the gaze, the calmness beneath it, the way the child observed before reacting. And it pressed against him with a familiarity he could not dismiss, forcing a question into the front of his mind that he was not ready to ask yet, not in words, not out loud, because once spoken, it would change everything. And Naomi, she watched him now, not with tension, not with expectation, but with a patience that felt deliberate, as if she already knew the path his thoughts were taking and had no intention of interrupting them. And that control, that quiet awareness, unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because it meant she was not reacting to him. She was allowing him to arrive at something on his own, and that placed him in a position he was not used to, one where he had to feel his way forward instead of directing the moment. And when he finally spoke, the word felt smaller than he intended, almost out of place against the silence that had settled around them. Naomi, her name leaving his mouth without the authority he carried everywhere else, and she acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head. Nothing more. No softening, no resistance, just recognition, as if the name belonged to a different version of her life, and the absence of reaction forced him to continue, to fill the space that she refused to fill for him. I did not expect to see you here. The sentence sounding insufficient even as he said it, because it reduced something complex to something casual, and he knew she heard that, saw it in the brief shift of her eyes, the way she held his gaze just long enough to let him feel the weight of his own words before she responded. That is usually how time works. Her voice calm, steady, untouched by the past he carried into the moment, and there was no edge in it, no bitterness, just a simple truth delivered without decoration. And it landed in a way that made him aware of how much he had relied on the assumption that certain parts of his life would remain exactly where he left them, unchanged, waiting, and yet here she was, unchanged in a different way, not preserved, but evolved, complete without him. And the child leaned closer to her, sighed, instinctively, and Naomi's hand moved without hesitation, resting gently against the small shoulder in a motion that spoke of habit, of repetition, of years built in quiet consistency. And Ethan noticed that, not just the action, but the ease of it, the way it fit into her without thought, and something tightened in his chest, something that had nothing to do with business or control or logic, something unfamiliar in its simplicity, because there are things that cannot be calculated, only witnessed, and he was witnessing something he had never accounted for. And when his eyes returned to the child, there was no avoiding it now. The connection, the question pressing harder, clearer, demanding to be acknowledged, and he felt it in the way his breath shifted, in the slight tension in his shoulders, in the way his mind searched for an explanation that would make this moment easier to navigate. But none came, because the simplest answer was also the most difficult, and Naomi did not rush him, did not guide him. She simply remained present, allowing the silence to do what words could not. And in that silence, he found himself stepping further into a reality he had never prepared for, his voice lower now, more careful. How long have you been back? It was not the question he wanted to ask, but it was the one he could manage, and she answered it just as simply. Long enough. Again, no elaboration, no invitation for more, just a boundary set with precision, and he understood then that every answer she gave would be exactly that, enough to respond, nothing more, because the rest was not his to access freely anymore. And that realization shifted something in him, forcing him to approach the moment differently, to let go of the instinct to control the conversation, and instead, he let his attention return to the child, because that was where the truth was anchored, not in their history, not in what had been said or left unsaid years ago, but in what stood in front of him now, alive, undeniable. And he felt the question rise again, stronger this time, no longer avoidable, no longer something he could push aside. And when he finally spoke, it came out quieter than he expected, almost careful, as if the words themselves required a certain respect. What is his name? It was not direct, not yet, but it was closer, and Naomi's gaze held his for a fraction longer this time. Something subtle passing through her expression, not emotion, not exactly, but recognition of the step he had just taken, and she answered without hesitation, Miles, the name settling into the space between them with a weight that felt both new and deeply rooted, and Ethan repeated it silently in his mind, testing it against the recognition that had already formed, feeling how naturally it fit into the growing realization he could no longer deny. And Miles looked at him again, more openly. This time, curiosity clear, unguarded, and there it was, unmistakable now, not just resemblance, but something deeper, something that connected beyond appearance, and Ethan felt it fully then, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth unfolding in real time. And his voice, when it came again, was no longer searching for small talk, no longer trying to navigate around the reality in front of him. It moved straight toward it, drawn by something he could not ignore. Naomi, he said. Again, but this time it carried something different, something heavier, something closer to the truth he was about to face. And in that moment, before the next question could form, before the silence could shift again, he understood that whatever answer came next would not just explain the present, it would redefine everything he thought he knew about his past, his choices, and the life he believed he had built without consequence. The words sat between them before it was spoken, heavy, inevitable, and when Ethan finally let it surface, it did not come out with the confidence that had defined him for years. It came out measured, controlled, as if he understood that the wrong tone could fracture something that was already delicate. Naomi, he said again, and this time there was no attempt to soften the moment with distance or politeness, no attempt to frame it as anything other than what it was becoming. I need you to tell me the truth. And the way he said it carried a quiet urgency, not loud, not demanding, but anchored in something deeper than curiosity, because the question was no longer optional, it was necessary. And Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she was searching for an answer, but because she did not rush for his understanding. She never had, and that had always been the part he misunderstood about her, the part he once interpreted as patience, when in reality it had always been strength, the ability to stand in silence without needing to fill it. And now, years later, that same strength framed her again, unchanged in its core, but refined by time, and she glanced briefly at Miles, her hand resting lightly against his back, a small grounding gesture that said more than any explanation could. And then she looked back at Ethan, her expression steady, unshaken. I already have, she said, and the simplicity of her response forced him to confront the fact that the truth was not hidden behind complexity. It was sitting directly in front of him, in the shape of a child, in the quiet confirmation of her voice, and still, something inside him resisted fully stepping into it. Not because he doubted her, but because accepting it meant revisiting a past he had deliberately sealed off, a decision he had made with certainty, with logic, with the belief that it was the right move at the time, and now that certainty was unraveling in a way that felt both slow and absolute. And he felt it in the way his chest tightened, in the way his thoughts no longer aligned in neat, controlled lines, but instead collided, overlapping with memory and realization. And he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his gaze shifting briefly away, before returning to her, because he could not look anywhere else for long, not when the answer was standing in front of him. And when he spoke again, The words were quieter, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Miles," he said, repeating the name as if it might reveal something more if he held on to it long enough. "How old is he?" And Naomi did not hesitate. 4. And that number landed with a precision that left no room for interpretation, no space to negotiate what it meant, and Ethan felt it. Immediately, not as a dramatic shock, but as a clear alignment of time, of choices, of absence. And suddenly the gap between then and now was no longer abstract. It was measurable, it was defined, it had a shape, and it led directly back to a moment he had chosen to walk away from. And the memory surfaced without invitation, a night framed by quiet tension, by words that had not been as careful as they should have been, by a decision made too quickly under the belief that it was necessary, that distance would simplify things, that moving forward required leaving something behind. And he had done exactly that. He had left, without looking back, without checking, without asking if there was anything he had not seen yet. And now that absence stood in front of him, not as an accusation, not as anger, but as a reality he could not rewrite. And Naomi watched him take that in, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a calm understanding of what it meant for him to arrive here, because she had already lived through the part he was only now beginning to face, and she had done it without him, without explanation, without closure. And that difference, that separation of experience, placed them on two completely different timelines within the same moment. And Ethan felt that too. The distance between what he was discovering and what she had already accepted, and it shifted something in his posture, in the way he stood, less certain, less anchored in the control he usually carried, because control had no place here, not in a moment that was built entirely on truth. And he looked at Miles again, really looked this time, not just at the resemblance, but at the presence, at the way the child existed without awareness of the weight surrounding him. And there was something grounding in that, something that made the situation real in a way that no conversation ever could. And when Ethan spoke again, it was not to fill silence, it was to understand. "Why did you not tell me?" The question came out steady, but there was something underneath it, something that carried more than curiosity, something closer to regret. And Naomi held his gaze without flinching, without softening, because this was not a moment for comfort, it was a moment for clarity. And when she answered, her voice remained even, deliberate. "Because you made it clear you did not want anything that would change your plans." And there was no accusation in her tone, no raised edge, just a statement of fact, something she had accepted long before this moment existed. And it settled into the space between them with a weight that was impossible to ignore, because it was true, not exaggerated, not distorted, simply true. And Ethan felt it, not as a defense he could argue against, but as a reflection of something he had said, something he had meant at the time, something he had believed was necessary. And now, standing here, that same belief felt incomplete, insufficient, because it had not accounted for this, for Miles, for the life that had continued without him. And he exhaled slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the back of the chair beside him, as if grounding himself in something physical might help him process what he was hearing. But there was no shortcut through this, no way to move past it without acknowledging it fully. And when he looked back at Naomi, there was a shift in his expression, subtle, but real, the beginning of something he had not allowed himself to feel before. And it was not immediate redemption, not sudden clarity, but the first crack in a certainty that had defined him for too long. And Naomi saw it, not because she was searching for it, but because she understood what it looked like when someone finally began to see beyond their own version of events. And still, she did not move toward him, did not offer anything more than what she already had, because the truth had been given, and what he did with it was no longer her responsibility. And the silence that followed was different now, not empty, not uncertain, but full, carrying the weight of what had just been revealed. And in that silence, Ethan understood something he had not understood before, that this was not about reclaiming something he had lost. It was about recognizing something he had never taken the time to see. And that realization did not come with relief, it came with the quiet, undeniable awareness that some things cannot be undone, they can only be faced. The silence did not break, it settled, deeper this time, no longer uncertain but defined by everything that had just been placed between them. And Ethan remained where he was, Not because he did not know how to leave, but because leaving now would mean turning his back on something he could no longer pretend did not exist. And for the first time in years, that instinct to walk away, to close the door and move forward without looking back, did not come as easily as it once had. Because this was not a situation that could be simplified into a decision or filed away into the past. This was present, undeniable. And it had a name. It had a face. It had a quiet presence sitting just inches from him. And as he stood there, trying to process the weight of it, Miles shifted again, his small hand reaching toward a glass of water on the table, careful, deliberate, and Naomi adjusted it slightly closer to him without looking, her attention divided in a way that spoke of familiarity, of a rhythm built over time, and Ethan noticed that too. The way she moved without hesitation, without second thought, the way her focus never fully left the child even while she was speaking to him, and it pressed against him in a way that was difficult to ignore, because it represented something he had not been part of, something that had developed without him, something that had grown into a complete world he was only now stepping into as an outsider. And the realization carried a quiet kind of gravity, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a truth that would not fade no matter how still he stood. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to Naomi, because there was still something he needed to understand, something that had not yet been said. You decided all of this on your own. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, not of anger, but of disbelief, of someone trying to grasp how an entire life could unfold without their knowledge. And Naomi did not react to the implication, did not rise to it, because she had already lived through the part where that question mattered, and now it was simply a statement she could respond to without emotion. I decided to move forward, she said, her tone even. You decided to leave. And again, there was no accusation. Just a clear separation of actions, of choices, and the distinction mattered more than anything else, because it removed the illusion that this had been a shared outcome. It had not. It had been two separate decisions that led to one undeniable result, and Ethan felt that settle into him, not as something he could argue, but as something he had to accept, because it was true, and he knew it was true, even if he had never considered the full extent of what that truth would lead to. And his hand tightened slightly at his side, a small, controlled reaction that reflected the tension building beneath the surface, not outward, not visible in the way he usually allowed emotion to show, but present, undeniable. And he glanced at Miles again, this time longer, allowing himself to observe without pulling back, to take in the details he had been resisting, the way the child sat comfortably, the way his attention shifted between the world around him and the quiet presence of his mother. And there was something grounding in that, something that made the situation real in a way no explanation ever could. And when Ethan spoke again, it was quieter, less guarded. Does he know? The question hung carefully in the air, and Naomi understood exactly what he meant without needing clarification. He knows what matters, she said, her voice softening just slightly, not for Ethan, but for the truth behind the words. He knows he is loved. He knows he is safe. He knows who has been there. And that last part lingered, not emphasized, not forced, but present, and Ethan felt it, not as a direct accusation, but as a reality he could not deny, because presence is not something that can be replaced by intention. It is measured in time, in consistency, in the small moments that build into something larger. And he had not been there for those moments. He had not been part of that foundation. And now he stood outside of it, trying to understand where he fit, if he fit at all. And that uncertainty was unfamiliar, unsettling, because it placed him in a position he had not occupied before, one where he did not have control, where the outcome was not his to decide alone. And Naomi watched him navigate that without interference, because this was not something she could guide him through. It was something he had to face on his own. And Miles looked up again, his gaze moving between them with quiet curiosity, sensing something without fully understanding it. And there was a moment, brief but significant, where Ethan met his eyes directly, not as a passing glance, but as a connection, unspoken, unconfirmed, yet impossible to ignore. And something shifted in that moment, something subtle, but real, a recognition that went beyond logic, beyond explanation, and Ethan felt it settle into him, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning of something he had not anticipated, and he looked back at Naomi, his expression no longer searching for answers in the same way, but holding something else now, something more grounded, more aware. What happens now? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before it, because it was not just about the present moment. It was about the future, about what could exist beyond this conversation, and Naomi did not rush to answer, because she understood what the question truly meant, and she also understood that the answer was not hers to give alone. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, unchanged. That depends on you. And the words landed with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Because for the first time in this entire exchange, the direction of what came next was placed entirely in his hands, not as a position of control, but as a responsibility, and Ethan felt that shift immediately, the weight of it, the implication of it, because this was no longer about understanding the past. It was about deciding what he would do with the truth he had been given, and that decision would define everything that followed, not just for him, but for the life he had just discovered. And as he stood there, the city lights still flickering in the glass behind Naomi, the quiet hum of the cafe returning to his awareness, he realized that this moment, as still as it appeared, was the beginning of something that could not be undone, only faced. The question did not fade after she answered it. It stayed, anchored in the space between them, quiet but unyielding, and Ethan felt the weight of it settle deeper into his chest, not as pressure from her, but as something internal, something that could not be ignored now that it had been placed in front of him. Because what happens now was not a theoretical question, it was immediate, real, and it required more than the kind of decisions he was used to making in boardrooms or negotiations. This was not about strategy or advantage, it was about presence, about consistency, about something that could not be built overnight no matter how much power or influence he carried. And for a moment, he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because he understood that whatever he said next could not be empty. It could not be framed. It had to come from a place he was not used to operating from. And Naomi did not rush him, did not fill the silence, because she had already done her part. She had brought the truth into the open, and what came next belonged entirely to him. And Miles shifted slightly in his seat, his attention moving toward a small toy car resting near his hand, rolling it gently across the table's surface with quiet focus, the soft sound of plastic against wood creating a rhythm that felt almost grounding, almost steady, and Ethan found himself watching that simple motion, not because it held significance on its own, but because it represented something real, something untouched by the tension in the air, something that existed without expectation or complication, and it pulled him further into the moment, away from abstraction, away from the distance he had always maintained, and closer to something tangible, something he could not approach with detachment. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, not sharp, not defensive, but deliberate. I do not want to stand here pretending I can fix this in one conversation. The words came slowly, measured, as if he was choosing them carefully. I cannot change what I did, and I am not going to insult you by acting like I can. And Naomi held his gaze, listening, not with expectation, but with attention, because this was the first time he had spoken without trying to control the outcome, and that mattered more than the words themselves. And he continued, his voice steady but quieter now, but I am here, and I am not walking away again. And there was no emphasis, no attempt to make it sound stronger than it was, just a statement, simple and direct, and the absence of performance in his tone made it land differently, because it did not ask for belief. It simply existed, and Naomi considered it for a moment, not searching for flaws, not testing it, just acknowledging it for what it was, a beginning, not a solution, and she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough to signal that she had heard him, and that was all she offered. No validation, no rejection, just acknowledgement. Because trust was not something that could be rebuilt in a single exchange. It was something that would have to be proven over time. And she had already lived long enough without depending on it to know that. And Ethan understood that too. Not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize that this was not about convincing her of anything. It was about showing up, consistently, without expectation of immediate acceptance. And that realization shifted something in him. grounding his next words in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. "I would like to know him," he said, his gaze briefly moving to Miles before returning to Naomi. "Not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone who is present." And there was a pause after that, not because he was unsure, but because he knew that what he was asking required more than intention. It required permission, and Naomi did not answer right away, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the weight of what he was asking, and more importantly, she understood the responsibility of deciding how and when that would happen. Because this was not just about Ethan, it was about Miles, about protecting the stability she had built, about ensuring that any step forward did not disrupt what had already been established. And she looked at her son, watching the way he focused on his toy, the quiet ease in his posture, the comfort in his environment. And then she looked back at Ethan, her expression calm but firm. "He does not need promises," she said, her voice steady. "He needs consistency." And the distinction was clear, precise, leaving no room for interpretation, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that this was not a negotiation, it was a standard, and if he could not meet it, then there was no point in stepping forward at all. And he accepted that without argument, because for the first time, he was not trying to find a way around the situation. He was trying to understand what it required of him, and that difference mattered, even if it was subtle. And Miles glanced up again, his eyes meeting Ethan's briefly, and this time, Ethan did not look away. He held the gaze, allowing the connection to exist without forcing it into something it was not yet. And there was something in that moment, quiet, unspoken, but real, something that did not need explanation to be understood, and Naomi saw it, too, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility, something that could exist if handled with care, with patience, with respect for the time it would take to build it properly. And she reached for her bag, her movements calm, unhurried, signaling a shift in the moment, not abrupt, not final, but transitional, and Ethan noticed it immediately, the way the conversation was naturally coming to a close, not because everything had been resolved, but because enough had been said for now. And when Naomi stood, Miles followed easily, his small hand finding hers without hesitation, a simple, practiced motion that spoke of trust built over years. And Ethan remained where he was, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just present, watching as she prepared to leave. And for a brief second, their eyes met again, and there was no tension in it this time, no unresolved question pressing between them, just an understanding that this was not an ending, but the first step in something that would require more than words to define. And Naomi gave a small nod, not as approval, not as permission, but as acknowledgement of what had been said. And then she turned, guiding Miles toward the door, her posture steady, her pace unhurried, and Ethan watched them go, not with the detachment he once would have had, but with a quiet awareness of what it meant to let them walk away without losing them again. Because this time, walking away was not the end, it was the space between moments, the space where choices would be made, not in words, but in actions. And as the door closed behind them, the sound soft against the backdrop of the cafe, Ethan remained standing, the weight of the moment still present, but different now, not overwhelming, not distant, but clear, defined by a single truth he could not ignore, that what came next would not be decided in a single night, but in every step he chose to take after it. The door closed with a soft click that barely carried across the cafe, but for Ethan, it echoed longer than it should have, stretching into the quiet that followed as if marking the exact point where something in his life had shifted without asking for permission. And he remained standing there for a moment longer than necessary, not because he did not know how to move, but because moving meant stepping into a version of reality that felt unfamiliar, one where control was replaced by consequence, and certainty had been replaced by something slower, something that required patience instead of precision. And when he finally sat down, the chair felt colder than before, the table emptier, the space across from him no longer occupied by the presence that had just redefined everything he thought he understood. And he let out a slow breath, his hand resting flat against the surface as if grounding himself in something physical might steady the shift inside him. But it did not. Because this was not something that could be stabilized in a single moment. It was something that would follow him beyond this room, into every decision that came next, and his mind moved, not in the structured way it usually did, but in fragments, revisiting details he had not allowed himself to see clearly until now. The timing, the absence, the quiet finality of the choices he had made years ago, and how those choices had not ended anything. They had simply redirected it into a life he had not been part of, and that realization carried a different kind of weight, one that did not press down but instead settled in, steady and constant. And when he finally stood again, it was not with urgency, not with the sharp focus he carried when leaving meetings or closing deals, but with a deliberate calm, as if he understood that whatever came next would not respond to speed, it would respond to consistency. And that thought stayed with him as he stepped outside, the cool night air meeting him. With a clarity that felt sharper than the warmth he had just left behind, the city alive in its usual rhythm, cars passing, distant voices blending into a steady hum, everything continuing exactly as it always had, and yet nothing felt the same, because the world had not changed, but his position within it had, and he stood there for a moment, hands at his sides, eyes scanning the street, not in search of anything, but in quiet recognition of the fact that the path ahead was no longer as linear as he had once believed. And then he moved, not toward an immediate solution, not toward a place where everything could be resolved, but toward something smaller, something necessary, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that the only way forward was not through large gestures or sudden decisions. It was through presence, repeated, consistent, unforced, and the thought did not overwhelm him. It grounded him, because it gave shape to what had previously felt uncertain, and by the time he reached his car, the initial shock of the evening had softened into something more defined, something that could be carried rather than avoided. And when he sat behind the wheel, his hands resting lightly against the steering wheel, he did not start the engine right away. Instead, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, a moment to acknowledge what had just happened without trying to rush past it. Because this was not something he could move on from quickly, it was something he had to move through, step by step. And when he finally drove away, the city lights stretching ahead of him in long, blurred lines, his mind was not filled with plans or strategies. It was filled with something quieter, something more deliberate, the understanding that if he meant what he had said, if he truly was not going to walk away again, then that decision would have to be reflected in actions that followed, not just tonight, not just tomorrow, but consistently, over time. And that realization stayed with him as the hours passed, carrying into the next morning in a way that felt different from his usual routine. Because when the first light filtered through the windows of his apartment, he was already awake, not out of habit, but because his mind had not settled into its usual patterns. Instead, it had remained focused on a single point, the reality that existed outside of his structured life. And as he moved through the early hours, the quiet of his space surrounding him, he noticed the absence of urgency, the lack of immediate deadlines pressing in, and for once, that did not feel like relief. It felt like space that could either be filled with avoidance or with intention, and he chose the latter, not through a dramatic shift, but through a simple decision, one that did not require announcement or validation. And when he reached for his phone, it was not to return emails or check schedules, it was to act on something that mattered in a different way. And he paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what he was about to step into. Because this was not a message he could approach casually, it was something that needed to reflect the understanding he was beginning to form. And when he finally typed, the words were simple, direct, without unnecessary framing, a request, not a demand, a step, not a leap. And when he sent it, he did not immediately check for a response, did not wait for confirmation, because he understood now that this was not about instant results, it was about showing up, and that would take time. And as the day moved forward, as meetings resumed, as responsibilities returned, there was a difference in the way he carried himself, subtle, but present, because beneath everything else, there was now a constant awareness, a quiet anchor that shifted how he viewed the hours ahead, not as something to be filled, but as something to be aligned with a decision he had made. And for the first time, that alignment did not come from ambition or expectation. It came from something steadier, something that did not need to be proven in a single moment, because it would be proven over many, and somewhere across the city, in a life he had only just begun to understand. That same day continued for Naomi and Miles, unchanged in its rhythm, grounded in the consistency they had built together, unaware of the shift taking place on the other side. And that contrast, that separation of experience, remained, not as a barrier, but as a reminder of what it would take to bridge it, not with words, not with promises, but with time. And as the day moved forward, one quiet truth settled into place, steady and clear, that this was no longer about discovering what had been hidden. It was about becoming someone who could be present for what had always been there. The message did not receive an immediate reply, and Ethan did not expect it to, because he understood now that silence was not rejection, it was space, and space was something he had not respected before, something he had once tried to fill too quickly or ignore entirely. But this time, he let it exist without interference, allowing the hours to pass without checking his phone every few minutes, without searching for confirmation that he had been heard, because the decision he had made was not dependent on her response. It was anchored in what he had already chosen, and that difference shaped the way he moved through the rest of his day, steady, deliberate, without the usual urgency that came from chasing outcomes. And when evening settled again over the city, the lights returning to the streets in the same quiet rhythm as the night before, his phone finally vibrated against the surface of his desk, a single notification, nothing more, and he did not reach for it immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of control, a conscious pause that allowed him to meet the moment without rushing it. And when he finally picked it up, Naomi's name appeared on the screen, simple, unembellished, and the message beneath it was just as direct. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, Riverside Park. No explanation, no added context, just a time and a place. And Ethan read it once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because of what it represented. The first opening, small but significant, a step forward that carried more weight than any long conversation could have, and he felt that settle into him, not as excitement, not as relief, but as something steadier, something closer to responsibility. And he typed a brief reply. I will be there. Nothing more, because anything more would have been unnecessary. And he set the phone down, his attention returning to the quiet of the room around him. But the stillness felt different now, not empty, not waiting, but aligned with something that was beginning to take shape. And when Saturday arrived, the morning air carried a cool clarity that matched the shift inside him, the kind of early light that stretched across the city in soft lines, touching buildings and streets with a calm that felt almost intentional. And Ethan arrived at the park earlier than he needed to, not out of impatience, but out of understanding, because being on time was not enough. Being present meant being ready, and he stood near the edge of the walkway, hands relaxed at his sides, watching as people moved through their routines, runners passing by in steady rhythm, parents walking with strollers, the quiet movement of a city that did not pause for individual moments. And yet this moment, for him, carried a significance that set it apart from everything else. And when he saw them, Naomi and Miles approaching from the distance, the scene did not unfold dramatically. There was no sudden shift in the air, no pause in the world around them, just a simple continuation of motion. And yet his focus narrowed immediately, drawn to the familiarity of her posture, the steady way she walked, the small hand held securely in hers. And he remained where he was, not stepping forward too quickly, allowing them to close the distance at their own pace, because this was not something to be rushed. And when they reached him, the greeting was simple, understated, Naomi offering a small nod, Miles glancing up with curiosity, and Ethan returned the gesture with the same calm. Good morning. His voice even, matching the tone of the moment rather than trying to shape it, and Naomi acknowledged it quietly. Morning, before shifting her attention slightly toward Miles. This is Ethan, she said, her introduction measured, intentional, not assigning labels that had not yet been earned, just offering a name. And Miles looked at him with open curiosity, the kind that had not yet learned to guard itself. And Ethan met that gaze without overstepping it, without forcing familiarity. Hi, Miles, he said, his tone gentle, not performative, just present. And Miles responded with a small nod, his attention shifting briefly back to the path ahead. And Naomi began to walk again, the movement natural, unforced, and Ethan fell into step beside them, not too close, not too distant, allowing the space to define itself without intrusion. and for a while, there was no conversation, just the quiet rhythm of footsteps against the path, the soft sounds of the park filling the gaps, and Ethan did not rush to speak, did not feel the need to fill the silence, because he understood now that presence was not measured by words, it was measured by consistency, by the willingness to remain without forcing interaction, and after a few minutes, Miles slowed slightly, his attention drawn to a small patch of grass where other children were playing, and Naomi noticed immediately, her gaze following his, and she paused, giving him the freedom to move toward it, and he did, with the natural energy of a child, stepping into the open space with a sense of ease that spoke of comfort, of familiarity, and Ethan watched that, not from a distance of detachment, but from a place of quiet observation, allowing himself to take in the moment without trying to define it too quickly, and Naomi stood beside him, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes following Miles with a steady focus that reflected years of practice, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice low, calm, "He likes this spot," and Ethan nodded, acknowledging the information, not as small talk, but as something to remember, something that mattered, and they stood there together, not as two people reconnecting, not as something clearly defined, but as two individuals sharing a space shaped by a child who did not yet fully understand the shift taking place around him. And as the minutes passed, something subtle began to settle into place, not resolution, not clarity, but a rhythm, a quiet alignment of presence that did not demand explanation, and Ethan felt it, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something that would take time to understand, time to build, and for the first time since that night in the cafe, the uncertainty did not feel overwhelming. It felt structured, not by control, but by the simple, steady act of showing up. The morning did not rush them. It unfolded slowly, like the light stretching across the open field, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping into Miles's space, not inserting himself into a rhythm that had existed long before he arrived, but observing, learning, allowing each small moment to reveal something he had never taken the time to understand before, and Miles moved easily among the other children, his laughter quiet but present, his attention shifting between a ball rolling across the grass and the distant sound of someone calling out from the path, and Naomi watched him with the same steady awareness, her posture relaxed but grounded, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet never fully disengaged, and Ethan noticed that, not just the consistency of it, but the intention behind it. The way every small decision she made centered around creating a space where Miles felt secure without being restricted, and it was a kind of balance he had never needed to consider before, not in his world of calculated outcomes and structured plans, and for a moment, he found himself unsure of where to stand, not physically, but in the context of what this moment required from him, and that uncertainty did not frustrate him. It slowed him down, forced him to remain aware instead of reactive, and Naomi glanced at him briefly, as if recognizing the shift, not judging it, not correcting it, just acknowledging that he was beginning to understand something that could not be explained in a single conversation. And when she spoke, her voice remained quiet, blending naturally into the calm of the park. He takes his time with new people, and Ethan nodded, accepting that without question, because it made sense, because trust was not something that appeared instantly. It was built, gradually, through repeated moments that proved consistency over time. And he did not respond with reassurance or promises. He simply stayed where he was, allowing that understanding to guide his actions instead of trying to speak it into existence. And Miles eventually drifted back toward them, his small steps light against the path, his attention still half anchored in the play he had just left, and he stopped a few feet away, looking up at Ethan with a curiosity that felt slightly more open than before, not cautious, not distant, just observant, and Ethan met that gaze with the same steady calm, not forcing a connection, not pulling away from it, just allowing it to exist. And after a brief pause, Miles spoke, his voice soft but clear, "Do you come here a lot?" The question simple, direct, and Ethan understood immediately that this was not about the park. It was about presence, about whether he belonged in this space, even temporarily, and he answered without overthinking it. "I have not, but I would like to." And the honesty in that response landed differently than something rehearsed would have. because it did not try to claim familiarity that did not exist. It simply acknowledged where he was starting from, and Miles considered that for a moment, his expression thoughtful in a way that mirrored something deeper than his age might suggest. And then he nodded once, as if accepting the answer without needing more, and turned slightly back toward Naomi, his hand reaching for hers again. A small, grounding motion that Ethan now understood was not about dependence, but about connection, about knowing where safety was anchored, and Naomi responded without hesitation, her fingers closing gently around his, her attention shifting seamlessly between the two of them, and Ethan watched that, not with distance, but with awareness, because every small detail mattered, every gesture, every unspoken exchange, all of it building a picture of a life he was only just beginning to see clearly. And as they continued walking, the path opening ahead of them in long, quiet lines, the conversation remained minimal, not out of discomfort, but out of respect for the pace of the moment, and Ethan found that he did not need to fill it, did not need to guide it, because something more important was happening beneath the surface, something that could not be measured by words. And after a while, they reached a bench near the edge of the park, overlooking a stretch of water where the light reflected in soft, shifting patterns, and Naomi paused there, her attention moving briefly toward the view before returning to Miles, who climbed onto the bench with an ease that spoke of familiarity, and Ethan remained standing for a moment before sitting at the far end, leaving space between them that felt intentional, not distant, but respectful, and the quiet settled again. But this time it felt different, not uncertain, not heavy, but grounded, like a foundation that had begun to take shape without needing to be announced. And Naomi broke the silence first, her voice calm, steady. "This is not going to be fast." And Ethan understood immediately what she meant, not just the words, but the expectation behind them, and he nodded, not as agreement alone, but as acknowledgement, because he knew that this was not something he could accelerate, not something he could shape on his own terms, and that understanding did not feel restrictive, it felt necessary, and he responded simply, "I know." And for a moment, that was enough. No elaboration, no explanation, just a shared understanding of the pace that would define what came next, and Miles leaned slightly against Naomi's side, his attention drifting between the water and the quiet presence of the two adults beside him, unaware of the significance of the moment, yet fully part of it. And Ethan allowed himself to take that in, not as something to claim, not as something to define too quickly, but as something to respect, because this was not about stepping into a role, it was about earning a place. Slowly, through actions that aligned with the truth he had been given, and as the morning continued, the light shifting slightly, the sounds of the park rising and falling in gentle waves, Ethan realized that this moment, as simple as it appeared, was more important than anything he had done in years, not because of what it changed immediately, but because of what it required from him moving forward. And that requirement was clear, steady, and unchanging, to show up, again and again, without expectation, without control. And as he sat there, the space between them no longer feeling like a barrier but a beginning, he understood that this was how something real started, not with declarations, not with sudden transformation, but with presence, quiet, consistent, and willing to grow over time. The stillness by the water did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like something carefully held in place, and Ethan remained seated at the far end of the bench, not because the distance between them was required, but because he understood now that space was part of the process, something that could not be closed too quickly without breaking the rhythm that was beginning to form. And Miles leaned slightly forward, his small shoes tapping lightly against the wooden slats as he watched a duck glide across the surface of the water, the reflection stretching and bending with each ripple, and Naomi's hand rested lightly against his back, a quiet anchor that required no attention yet never disappeared. And Ethan noticed the consistency of that presence again, the way it existed without interruption, without hesitation, and it drew his attention not as something to admire from a distance, but as something to understand, because this was the standard, not words, not promises, but actions, repeated so often they became invisible, and he let that settle into him without trying to respond to it immediately, because he knew now that understanding came before action, and action had to follow naturally from that understanding. not the other way around. And after a moment, Miles shifted his focus away from the water, turning slightly toward Ethan, his expression open, thoughtful, as if something had formed in his mind that he was ready to place into words, and Ethan met his gaze calmly, not encouraging, not discouraging, just present, and Miles spoke with the same quiet clarity he had shown before. "Do you work?" The question simple, almost casual, but Ethan recognized immediately that it was not small talk. It was curiosity about who he was, about how he fit into the world, and more importantly, how that world might connect to Miles's own, and he answered without embellishment, "Yes, I do." And there was a brief pause, not because the answer was incomplete, but because Ethan understood that what mattered was not the title, not the scale of what he did, but how he explained it in a way that did not create distance. And he added, "I help build things, companies, projects, things that people use every day," keeping the explanation grounded, simple, and Miles nodded slowly, processing that in his own way, and then asked, "Do you like it?" And the question landed differently, more direct, more personal, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because it required a different kind of honesty, one he had not always allowed himself to express, and he considered it carefully before speaking. "I used to think that liking it was the most important part," he said, his voice steady. "Now I think understanding why I do it matters more." And Miles listened, not fully grasping the layers behind the words, but sensing the sincerity in them, and that seemed to be enough, because he nodded again, satisfied, and turned his attention back toward the water, and Naomi glanced at Ethan briefly, not with approval, not with judgment, but with recognition of the shift in how he was choosing to engage, and that small acknowledgement carried more weight than anything spoken, because it reflected an awareness that had not been present before, and the silence that followed felt different again, not tentative, not cautious, but settled, as if something had aligned, without needing to be announced. And after a few minutes, Naomi stood, her movement smooth, unhurried, signaling another transition, and Miles followed easily, his hand finding hers again, and Ethan rose as well, not waiting for direction, but responding naturally to the shift, and they began walking back along the path, the sunlight now higher, casting longer shadows that moved with them, stretching and contracting with each step, and the rhythm of their movement felt more defined than before, not perfectly synchronized, but no longer uncertain, and Ethan walked beside them with the same quiet awareness, not trying to lead, not falling behind, simply matching the pace that had already been set. And as they approached the edge of the park, where the path met the city streets again, Naomi slowed slightly, her attention shifting between the surroundings and Miles, who seemed content, calm, and Ethan recognized that too. The subtle cues that indicated the moment had reached its natural end, not abruptly, not forced, but complete for now, and Naomi turned slightly toward him, her expression steady, unchanged. "We will be here again next weekend," she said, her tone even, not inviting, not excluding, just stating a fact, and Ethan understood immediately what that meant. Not a guarantee, not a promise, but an opportunity, and he nodded once, accepting it without adding anything unnecessary, because anything more would have shifted the balance that had been established, and he responded simply, "I will be here." And the words carried the same quiet weight as before, not amplified, not softened, just present. And Naomi acknowledged it with a small nod, and then she turned, guiding Miles toward the sidewalk, their figures moving steadily into the flow of the city, and Ethan remained where he was for a moment, watching them go, not with the same sense of distance he had felt before, but with an awareness that this time, the space between them was not separation, it was time, time that would either be filled with consistent presence or left empty again. And as he stood there, the sounds of the city rising around him, the steady movement of people continuing without pause, he understood, something with a clarity that did not need repetition, that this was no longer about a single moment, a single meeting, or a single realization. It was about the accumulation of actions that would follow, the quiet decisions made day after day that would either build something real or confirm what had already been lost. And as he turned and began to walk in the opposite direction, his pace steady, his posture unchanged, there was a difference in the way he carried himself, not visible to anyone passing by, not marked by any external shift, but present in the quiet certainty that had replaced the uncertainty of before. Because now, he was no longer standing at the edge of something unknown. He had stepped into it, and what came next would not be determined by what he said, but by what he chose to do, consistently, without interruption, without retreat, and that understanding stayed with him as the morning gave way to the rest of the day, steady, unchanging, a foundation that would either hold or fall, depending entirely on the actions that followed it. The rest of that day did not feel like a continuation of his usual life. It felt like something had been quietly rearranged beneath the surface, and Ethan carried that awareness with him not as a distraction, but as a constant presence, something that did not fade when meetings resumed or when conversations demanded his attention, because every decision he made now passed through a different filter, one that was no longer focused solely on efficiency or outcome, but on alignment, on whether his actions reflected the truth he had stepped into. And the week that followed did not bring dramatic changes. It did not disrupt the structure of his world in obvious ways, but it shifted how he moved within it, subtly, consistently, and by the time the next Saturday arrived, he was already at the park again before the clock reached 10, not because he feared being late, but because being early had become a way of grounding himself, of reminding himself that this was not something to be squeezed between other obligations. It was something that required space, and the morning carried the same calm as before, the same soft light stretching across the open paths, the same quiet rhythm of footsteps and distant voices blending into the background. And when Naomi and Miles appeared again, walking toward him with the same steady pace, nothing about their presence felt unfamiliar this time, not because the situation had been resolved, but because the rhythm had begun to establish itself, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as comfort, but as clarity. And when they reached him, the greeting was just as simple as before, no unnecessary words, no attempt to redefine what had already been understood, and they began walking together again, the path unfolding ahead of them in a quiet, predictable way that allowed space for something else to grow, something not forced, something not rushed. And Miles stayed closer this time, his small steps naturally aligning with theirs, his attention moving between the world around him and the quiet presence beside him. And after a few minutes, he spoke again, his voice carrying the same curiosity as before, but now with a hint of familiarity. "Did you come last weekend too?" And Ethan understood immediately that the question was not about the past. It was about consistency, about whether his presence had meaning beyond a single moment. And he answered simply, "Yes, I did." And there was no elaboration, no attempt to turn it into something more, because the truth itself was enough. And Miles nodded, accepting that without hesitation, as if that single answer fit into something he was beginning to understand. And Naomi walked beside them, her attention steady, her expression unchanged. But there was a quiet awareness in the way she observed the exchange, not intervening, not guiding, just allowing it to unfold naturally. And Ethan felt that too. The way the space between them was no longer defined by uncertainty, but by possibility, something that required time, something that could not be rushed or assumed. And as they reached the same area by the water, the bench waiting in the same place as before, the familiarity of the setting created a subtle shift, not in what was happening, but in how it was experienced, because repetition has a way of building something invisible, something that strengthens with each return. And Ethan sat down again, leaving the same respectful distance, but the space felt different now, not as wide, not as undefined, but shaped by the moments that had come before. And Miles climbed onto the bench once more, his attention immediately drawn to the water, but his posture slightly more relaxed, his presence less cautious. And Ethan noticed that, not as a victory, not as something to claim, but as a sign, a small indication that something was beginning to settle into place. And he remained still, allowing the moment to exist without interference. And after a while, Naomi spoke, her voice calm, measured. "Consistency is not about showing up when it is convenient." And Ethan listened, understanding that this was not a general statement. It was something directed at him, something that carried weight beyond the words themselves. And she continued, "It is about being present when it matters, even when it is not easy." And there was no emphasis, no added explanation, just a clear expectation. and Ethan nodded, not defensively, not reactively, but with acknowledgement, because he understood that what she was saying was not something he could argue. It was something he had to demonstrate, and the simplicity of that requirement grounded him, because it removed the illusion that this could be solved with words alone. And as the morning continued, the quiet rhythm of the park surrounding them, Ethan realized that the process he had stepped into was not about rebuilding something that had been lost. It was about creating something new, something that did not rely on the past to define it, but on the present to shape it. And that realization shifted the way he approached each moment, not as a test, not as something to succeed or fail at, but as an opportunity to align his actions with what he had already chosen. And Miles leaned slightly closer again, his attention drifting between the water and the two adults beside him. And after a brief pause, he spoke once more, his voice softer this time, more thoughtful. "Are you coming next week too?" And the question carried a different weight now, not just curiosity, but expectation, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as pressure, but as responsibility, and he answered without hesitation, "Yes, I am." And the certainty in his voice was not forced. It was grounded in the decision he had already made, and Miles nodded again, his expression settling into something calm, something that did not require further confirmation. And Naomi watched that exchange quietly, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held the moment, not as guarded as before, not as distant, but still careful, still intentional. Because trust was not built on single answers, it was built on repetition, on time, and Ethan understood that, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that what mattered now was not what he said, but what he continued to do. And as the morning moved forward, the light shifting slightly, the sounds of the park rising and falling around them, something settled into place again, not final, not complete, but real. And as they eventually stood to leave, the movement natural, unforced, Ethan did not need to ask what came next. He already knew, not because it had been explained, but because it had been demonstrated. And as Naomi and Miles walked away once more, their pace steady, their connection unchanged, Ethan remained for a moment, not watching them with uncertainty, but with a quiet understanding that this was how something meaningful was built, not in a single moment, but in the quiet repetition of showing up, again and again, without interruption, without retreat, until presence itself became the proof. The pattern did not announce itself, it revealed itself quietly, one weekend at a time, one small moment layered over another until something invisible began to take form, and Ethan felt it not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual alignment, something that settled deeper with each Saturday morning that followed. And by the time the third weekend arrived, his presence at the park no longer felt like an interruption to the rhythm Naomi and Miles had built. It felt like something that had begun to fit within it, not seamlessly, not completely, but enough to be noticed in its consistency. And that consistency had not gone unseen, not by Naomi, not by Miles, and certainly not by Ethan himself, because each time he showed up, it required the same decision, the same quiet commitment to be there without expectation of immediate change. And that repetition had begun to reshape something inside him, something that extended beyond the park, beyond those few hours in the morning, and into the way he approached everything else in his life. And when he arrived that day, the air carried a different kind of clarity, the kind that comes when something is no longer new but not yet familiar enough to be taken for granted. And he saw them again, walking toward him in that same steady way. Naomi's posture unchanged, Miles's steps slightly more relaxed, and there was something subtle in the way Miles looked at him this time. Not just curiosity, not just observation, but recognition, as if Ethan had moved from being someone unfamiliar into someone expected, and that shift, small as it was, carried weight, and Ethan acknowledged it in the same quiet way he had approached everything else, not with reaction, but with presence. And when they greeted each other, the exchange remained simple, but the tone had shifted, not in words, but in the ease with which they were spoken. And as they began walking, the rhythm established itself more quickly, less space needed to find the pace, less silence required to settle into it. And Miles stayed closer again, his steps aligning naturally, his attention moving between the path and Ethan with a frequency that had not been there before. And after a few minutes, he spoke, his voice carrying a casual tone that felt new. "I told my friend about you." And Ethan glanced down slightly, his attention fully present. "You did?" he replied, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Miles nodded. "Yeah, I said you come here every weekend." And there was no emphasis in the statement, but the meaning behind it was clear. Consistency had been observed, it had been noticed, it had been shared, and Ethan felt that settle into him in a way that no acknowledgement from Naomi ever could, because this came from Miles, unfiltered, unstructured, and it reflected something real, something that could not be manufactured. And Naomi walked beside them, her gaze forward, but there was a subtle shift in her expression, something that suggested she had heard it, registered it, and understood its significance without needing to comment on it. And as they reached the same spot by the water, the bench once again waiting in quiet familiarity, the act of sitting down felt less like entering a moment and more like continuing one, and Ethan took his place at the end as before, but the distance between them felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way it was perceived, shaped by the repetition of presence rather than the absence of it. And Miles climbed up again, his movements easy, his posture relaxed, and for a while, they sat in the same quiet observation, the water moving in gentle patterns, the sounds of the park blending into a steady background. And then Naomi spoke, her voice calm, but carrying a different kind of weight this time. "He notices everything." And Ethan turned slightly, understanding that the statement was not casual, it was intentional. And she continued, "Not just what you say, but what you do, what you repeat, what you keep doing even when no one is asking you to." And the words settled into the moment with clarity, not as a warning, but as a reflection of reality. And Ethan nodded, absorbing that fully, because he understood now that consistency was not about proving something once. It was about continuing to prove it without interruption, and that understanding did not feel overwhelming. It felt grounding, because it defined the path forward in a way that did not rely on complexity. And as the morning continued, Miles leaned slightly toward Ethan, his attention shifting again, and after a brief pause, he asked, "Do you have a place where you go every week?" The question simple, but layered, and Ethan considered it honestly before answering. "I did not before," he said, his tone steady, "but I do now." And there was no need to specify, no need to explain, because the answer spoke for itself. And Miles smiled slightly, a small, unguarded expression that carried a sense of acceptance. And it stayed for just a moment before his attention shifted again. But that moment was enough to mark something that had not been there before, and Naomi saw it too, not reacting to it outwardly, but holding it within the quiet understanding she carried. And as they eventually stood again, preparing to leave as they had before, the transition felt less like an ending and more like a pause, something that would continue rather than conclude. And when Naomi turned to Ethan, her expression steady, she did not offer new instructions, she did not set new expectations, she simply said, "We will see you next week." And the words were not framed as a question, not offered as an invitation, they were stated as something understood, something that had already been established through action, and Ethan met that with the same quiet certainty. "I will be here." And this time, the words did not feel like a promise, they felt like a continuation, something that had already begun. And as they walked away once more, Miles glancing back briefly before turning forward again, Ethan remained where he was for a moment, the weight of the morning settling into something steady, something that no longer needed to be analyzed or questioned, because it had proven itself through repetition. And as he turned to leave, stepping back into the rhythm of the city beyond the park, there was a clarity in his movement that had not been there before, not visible, not dramatic, but real, because now, the path he was on was not defined by a single decision, but by a series of them, repeated, consistent, and aligned with something that no longer needed to be explained, only lived. By the fourth weekend, the routine no longer felt like something being tested, it felt like something being lived, and Ethan noticed it in the smallest details, in the way he no longer checked the time before leaving his apartment, in the way his steps toward the park carried a quiet certainty instead of a measured intention, and in the way his presence there no longer felt like an effort to belong, but simply a continuation of something that had already begun. And when he arrived that morning, the air was slightly cooler, the kind of crispness that hinted at a change in season, and the park carried a softer rhythm, fewer voices, longer stretches of quiet between passing footsteps, and he stood at the same place as before, not out of habit alone, but because it had become a point of alignment, a place where the week narrowed into something more focused, more grounded, and when Naomi and Miles appeared again, there was no shift in the air, no moment of pause, just a natural continuation, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as something new, but as something stable, something that had begun to hold its shape, and when they greeted each other, the exchange carried a subtle warmth, not spoken, not emphasized, but present in the ease of their voices, and as they walked, the rhythm settled quickly, the distance between them no longer needing to be measured, because it had already been understood, and Miles stayed close again, his steps steady, his attention shifting between the path and Ethan with a familiarity that had not been there at the beginning, and after a few minutes, he spoke, his voice casual, almost as if the question had been waiting. "Do you have a car?" And Ethan glanced down slightly, meeting his gaze with a calm nod. "Yes, I do." And Miles considered that, his expression thoughtful. "Is it fast?" And the question carried a child's curiosity, simple, unfiltered, and Ethan allowed a small, quiet smile to form, not exaggerated, not performative, just present. "It can be," he answered, keeping the tone light, grounded, and Miles nodded, as if satisfied, before adding, "Mine is red." And he gestured loosely with his hands, describing something small, something imagined or remembered, and Ethan listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. And Naomi walked beside them, her attention steady, her presence unchanged, but there was something quieter in the way she held the moment, something that suggested she no longer needed to observe every interaction as closely as before, not because she was disengaged, but because she had begun to trust the rhythm that was forming. And as they reached the bench by the water once more, the familiarity of the place felt deeper, not because anything had changed physically, but because of what had been layered onto it, week after week, and Ethan sat down again, the space between them, still present, but no longer defined by distance, and Miles climbed up beside Naomi, his posture relaxed, his attention moving easily between the water and the quiet conversation that lingered around him, and after a moment, Naomi spoke, her voice calm, steady. "He asked me about you during the week," and Ethan turned slightly, his attention fully present, not surprised, but aware of the weight behind the statement. And she continued, not in a big way, not with a lot of questions, just small things that stayed with him. And the words settled into the moment with a quiet significance, because they reflected something that could not be forced, something that had developed naturally, and Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that this was not a result of a single action, but of repeated presence, of showing up without interruption, and that understanding grounded him further, because it confirmed what he had already begun to feel, that this process was not about speed, it was about consistency, and Miles leaned slightly forward, his attention drawn again to the water, but after a moment, he turned back, his expression thoughtful. "Are you busy during the week?" And the question carried a different tone this time, not just curiosity, but a subtle attempt to understand where Ethan fit beyond the weekends, and Ethan considered it carefully before answering. "Sometimes I am," he said, his voice steady, "but I am learning how to make time for what matters." And the honesty in that response landed differently, because it did not try to present perfection, it acknowledged change, and Miles listened, his gaze steady, and then nodded, as if accepting that answer without needing more, and Naomi observed the exchange quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held the moment, not as guarded, not as distant, but still intentional, still measured, because trust was not something she would offer quickly, even if it had begun to take shape. And as the morning continued, the quiet rhythm of the park surrounding them, Ethan felt something settle more firmly into place, not just the routine, but the meaning behind it. The understanding that this was no longer about proving something to Naomi, or even to Miles. It was about becoming someone who could sustain this presence without interruption, someone who could align his actions with the reality he had stepped into. And that realization carried a quiet strength, something that did not need to be announced or validated, because it was reflected in the choices he continued to make. And as they eventually stood to leave, the movement familiar, unforced, Naomi turned slightly toward him, her gaze steady, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, not a resolution, not a conclusion, but an acknowledgement of the distance that had been crossed, not completely, not entirely, but enough to be recognized, and she spoke simply, "Same time next week," and the words carried no hesitation, no testing, just a continuation, and Ethan nodded, his response just as steady. "I will be here." And this time, the exchange felt less like a commitment and more like a fact, something that had already been established through repetition. And as Naomi and Miles walked away once more, their steps steady, their connection unchanged, Ethan remained for a moment, the quiet of the park settling around him. And he understood something with a clarity that did not require repetition, that this was no longer a question of whether he would show up. It was a matter of how he would continue to do so, consistently, without deviation, because presence, once established, required maintenance. And as he turned to leave, stepping back into the rhythm of the city, the path ahead did not feel uncertain. It felt defined, not by a final outcome, but by the steady accumulation of moments that would continue to shape what came next. The shift did not arrive with a single moment. It revealed itself in the way everything began to feel less like effort and more like truth. And by the time the next weekend came, Ethan no longer measured his steps toward the park. He no longer checked the time or considered what else he could have been doing, because this was no longer something that existed alongside his life. It had become part of it, woven into the rhythm of his weeks in a way that felt quiet but permanent. And when he arrived that morning, the light was softer, diffused by thin clouds that stretched across the sky, and the park carried a calm that felt deeper than before, as if even the air understood that something had settled into place. And when Naomi and Miles approached, there was no distance left to close, no uncertainty left to navigate, just a continuation of something that had already proven itself through time, and Ethan felt that immediately, not as relief, not as resolution, but as alignment. And when they greeted each other, the exchange was simple, but there was something new in it, something unspoken but present, a quiet familiarity that did not need to be acknowledged to be real. And as they began walking, Miles moved naturally between them, not stepping closer out of hesitation, but out of comfort, his small presence bridging a space that had once felt carefully measured. And Ethan noticed that, not as something to hold on to, but as something to respect, because it had not been given. It had been earned through repetition, through consistency, through the simple act of showing up without interruption. And as they reached the path by the water again, the place that had become their quiet center, they sat without needing to decide where or how, the positions falling into place with an ease that reflected everything that had come before. And for a while, there was no conversation, just the soft movement of water, the distant sounds of the city blending into something almost indistinguishable. And then Miles spoke, his voice carrying a different tone this time, not just curiosity, not just observation, but something more grounded, something that came from understanding rather than questioning. "Are you coming next weekend too?" And Ethan looked at him, not with the careful distance he had once held, but with a steady presence that matched the moment, and he answered, "Yes," without hesitation, without explanation, because at this point, the word did not need to be expanded. It had already been proven, and Miles nodded, a small, quiet gesture that carried more weight than it appeared, because it reflected acceptance, not of a single answer, but of a pattern that had been observed long enough to be trusted. And Naomi watched that exchange, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was something in her expression that had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, not a release of all caution, not a complete lowering of the wall she had built, but a recognition that something real had taken shape, something that could not be dismissed or undone easily. And she turned her attention toward Ethan, her voice calm, measured. "He asked me what to call you." And the words settled into the space between them with a quiet significance that carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because this was not about presence anymore. It was about identity, about how Ethan would exist within the life that had been built without him. And Ethan felt that immediately, not as pressure, but as responsibility. And he did not answer right away, because he understood that whatever he said would not just define a moment, it would define how he moved forward. And Naomi continued, her tone steady. I told him he could decide when he was ready, and there was no emphasis, no added expectation, just a simple acknowledgement of the process. And Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that this was not something he could claim, it was something that would have to come naturally, over time. And Miles looked between them, his expression thoughtful, as if he was aware that something important had been placed into the moment, even if he did not fully understand it yet. And Ethan met his gaze, not rushing to fill the silence, not trying to guide it, just allowing it to exist. And after a moment, Miles spoke again, his voice soft, but steady. Can I call you Ethan for now? And the simplicity of the question carried a quiet sincerity that made it more meaningful than anything more formal could have been. And Ethan nodded, a small, steady gesture. You can call me whatever feels right to you. And there was no attempt to shape the answer, no effort to direct it, just an openness that reflected everything he had learned over the past weeks. And Miles accepted that, nodding once before, turning his attention back to the water, the moment settling into place without needing further explanation. And Naomi observed quietly, her gaze moving between them, and for the first time, there was a softness in the way she held the moment, not because everything had been resolved, but because something had been proven, something that could not be undone by a single misstep, because it had been built over time. And as the morning continued, the light shifting gently across the water, Ethan realized that what had started as a moment of unexpected truth had become something entirely different, something that did not rely on the past to define it, but on the present to sustain it. And that realization did not come with a sense of completion, it came with a quiet understanding that this was only the beginning, not of fixing what had been broken, but of building something that had never existed before, something rooted in presence, in consistency, in the willingness to remain even when nothing demanded it. And as they eventually stood to leave, the movement natural, unforced, Naomi turned slightly toward him, her expression steady, and she gave a small nod, not as approval, not as permission, but as recognition. And Ethan returned it with the same quiet certainty, because he understood now that what mattered was not what had been said or done in a single moment, but what would continue to be done moving forward. And as Naomi and Miles walked away once more, their steps steady, their connection unchanged, Ethan did not remain behind this time. He turned and walked alongside them for a few steps before pausing, allowing the space to remain what it needed to be. And as he stood there, watching them continue down the path, the city stretching beyond the park in long, quiet lines, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that this was no longer about redemption. It was about presence, and presence, once chosen, had to be lived every day, not just when it was easy, not just when it was expected, but always. And as he turned to leave, stepping back into the rhythm of the world beyond, there was no uncertainty left in his movement, no hesitation in his direction, because the path ahead had already been defined, not by a single choice, but by the quiet, consistent act of showing up, again and again, until it became who he was.